Good evening. Happy Friday. Welcome to the show. The best in paranormal talk radio begins now. We've got an interesting show lined up tonight, Tim, and I know I say that at the beginning of every show, but that's because I believe it.
Yeah.
Our guest for the first hour, Dr. Darren Aldridge, will be talking about the supernatural in Tudor and Stuart England. A little later in the show, we'll be joined by Graham Phillips. His new book, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, The Search for Camelot and the Isle of Avalon. So many people fascinated by that story. Could it be true? Is there reality behind the fantasy and fable of King Arthur? We'll discuss that in the next 2 hours of the show. So let's jump in right now while we can. Dr. Darren Aldridge is on the line. He's a specialist in early modern religious history with a particular interest in witchcraft and the devil. He's published widely in the area. His most recent books are The Devil, A Very Short Introduction, The Devil in Tudor and Stuart England, and as editor of The Witchcraft Reader. Welcome to the show, Dr. Darren Aldridge. Thank you for joining us this evening, sir.
Hello, Dave. It's good to be here. I hope the line is okay. There were some demons trying to interfere earlier.
That's what it sounds like. We're getting a little bit of static and buzz, but we'll get through this. I've got to ask you, Dr. Aldridge, where did your interest in witchcraft and the devil begin?
I've always been interested in religion, and I guess the devil is really another way of thinking about God and thinking about the conventional side of religion. And when I started looking at the devil, I discovered that hardly anyone else was. So there's a wide open field. There's so much written about conventional theology, but if you start looking at diabology, there's not very much at all. But if you look at the 16th and 17th centuries, people talked about little else. The devil is absolutely everywhere. So I've got all of this stuff to look at, and hardly anyone else is doing it. So I spent the last 20 years doing this, and now a few scholars are catching up, and there's now a small community of devil scholars, but it's still a wide open field.
In your opinion, when we refer to the devil, is the devil more a concept, or is it a supernatural being?
We don't know anything at all about the devil except what people have believed about the devil. And even if the devil were real, and even if he did appear to me right now in the room that I'm standing in, I still wouldn't know much about him because he would lie to me. So everything that we can say about the devil has to be based on what other people have believed, and that's really all that historians can do. So I would say the devil is a character in Christian mythology, and that's the best way to understand him. Whether or not people believe that character is real is up to them. For me, he is a figment, but either way, the only things that we can say meaningfully about him are about what other people have believed.
All right, and then if you could, with your study into religion and witchcraft and the supernatural, break down for us. I don't know if over here on American soil, if we have a full understanding or grasp of really what witchcraft is. We have the Hollywoodized version of it, but I don't know. Is there much of a difference between what we perceive witchcraft to be and what it truly is?
Okay. In the age of witch persecutions, witchcraft meant at least three different things to people. Most people believed in bad magic, and bad magic was just the harmful version of the manipulation of unseen powers, which everyone accepted was possible. And if you used magical powers to do harm, that was witchcraft. And that was what most people were scared of. There was also a belief that these harmful powers were connected in some way with the devil. That's where the devil comes in. So a fewer people believed also that witches entered pacts with the devil in order to harm their neighbours. And then there was a much smaller group of people who were mostly well-educated who believed that witches actually gathered at night in order secretly and dreadfully to worship the devil and to offer horrible sacrifices to him, as well as making pacts and practicing bad magic. So there were three different levels of belief. The most common was that simple belief in harmful magic, but as you move away from popular culture and towards the beliefs of more educated men, you move closer to this more terrible and more dramatic idea of the devil as a kind of secret satanic conspiracy.
Has there ever been any real proof of magic?
Of magic?
Right. When we talk,
goodness. Well, I do not believe in magic because I'm a rationalist and a materialist.
Mm-hmm.
But anyone who lived in the 16th or the 17th centuries in North America or in Europe would have believed in magic because it was what philosophers call a background belief. Everybody accepted that there were invisible powers that could be manipulated. That was almost universally taken for granted. And also, within Christian culture, people accepted the authority of the Bible, and the Bible is full of spirits. There are, in the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, some 200 references to angels. And in the New Testament, the most common miracle attributed to Jesus is the dispossession of people afflicted with evil spirits. So there was really strong reason to believe both in the existence of occult powers, and all that means is invisible forces that can be manipulated, and also the existence of spirits, because Scripture told us that these things were real. And pretty much everybody accepted that those things existed in the world around them. And if you put those two ideas together, you come up with a world in which everybody was vulnerable, potentially, to harmful invisible forces, either the activity of spirits or the manipulations of unseen powers by people who sometimes could be classified as witches.
When people are evoking Satan or the devil or witchcraft, trying to call upon spells and craft some kind of experience, and I know that you said back then people had a wider belief in these things, you know, and what was going on. Do you believe that with the concept of intention and the concept of many of the things that are latent within us as human beings, that we have had the ability to do things that would appear to be magic-like?
I think so, yes. I think that if you take into account the living conditions of people 300 or 400 years ago, in agricultural economies that were very poor, where everyone depended on everyone else, most people lived in big, extended households, and people saw one another day to day, and there wasn't really any privacy at all. I believe in cultures such as this, people could influence one another through bad feeling. And there's plenty of evidence. If you look at the casebooks of 17th century English physicians, for example, of husbands or wives or children or servants falling sick after they had fallen out with one of their neighbours or a member of their family, and they believed, perhaps rightly, that the person had given them a bad look or an ill tongue or perhaps even put a curse on them. And these things did have physical effects because people depended on one another, people believed in these powers, and also, of course, people were relatively poor, they were often malnourished, their immune systems were not very strong. So I do believe that there were real effects that we perhaps would explain today in medical terms, but nonetheless real effects that people experienced in the 16th and 17th centuries. So to that extent, yes, magic could produce outcomes, though perhaps people living at the time would understand them in a very different way to us.
Were they dealing with things like possession back then as well? Did they believe that people were taking on the attributes of demonic encounters, as you know, their bodies would twist and contort, speaking in unknown or foreign languages, those type of activities? Or was that not until later in life that type of, and I'm talking more like maybe coming out of the Dark Ages, real belief in possession taking place?
Possession is really important from the late Middle Ages, by which I mean the late 15th century, through the 16th and the 17th centuries. What historians call the early modern period was really the golden age of demon possession. And it was relatively common, and it was very easily identified. The symptoms were remarkably consistent. People would writhe, and they would yell, and they would recoil from pious things. Depending on whether they were Catholics or Protestants, they might recoil from the words of Scripture or the sprinkling of holy water. And their voices would change. Their voice would become deep and guttural, or it would be shrill. And it would seem to emit from parts of their bodies other than their mouths. And their heads would twist, and their bodies would, their legs and their arms would twitch. And very often, in the English cases, and I think probably in colonial America as well, these nasty little lumps would appear inside their bodies, rather like parasites, which are often described in the surviving accounts, moving about the body. And in Catholic versions, you get these things chased around the body by crucifixes and the sprinkling of holy water. So this is an extraordinarily physical and wrenching experience that was so well known in the 16th and the 17th centuries that people were able to identify the symptoms, and they knew what a possession looked like. They could tell it from anything else. And yes, it really was in this period that many people, and especially young people, particularly young women, suffered from demonic affliction of this kind. And often it was connected to witchcraft. In English-speaking parts of the world, in England, in North America, and to some extent in Scotland as well, a person possessed by a demon would normally accuse another person through harmful magic of casting the demon into their body. So in most cases, in the English-speaking world at least, the experience of demon possession was also a case of witchcraft.
All right, we need to take a quick break. We'll continue our journey. Dr. Darren Oldridge, our guest this evening, as we talk about the devil and supernatural in Tudor and Stuart England. We'll do that next here on Darkness Radio. On Darkness Radio, my guest, Dr. Darren Oldridge. Dr. Oldridge, you've written some fascinating books, and again, kind of having a love and interest in history and the supernatural and the paranormal. This is right up our listeners' alley. We'll put up a link to the doctor's website and to the Amazon page. You can find his books, Strange Histories. There's The Devil, a very short introduction, and The Devil in Tudor and Stuart England. Just go to darknessradio.com and click on the guests icon there, the guest tab. You'll find all the information about our guest and the links to his books and such. I want to kind of discuss as we move through this the belief systems of that time era. I know in the Strange Histories book you cover everything from The Walking Dead to ghosts, werewolves, witches, and so on. How prevalent was it? I mean, was it just a very superstitious culture back then, easy to manipulate, easy to fool people with stories and legends and lore?
I don't think so, no. I think that people in this period were no more and no less rational than we are today. But I think you need to accept that it's possible to be rational within very different assumptions about the world. I would say a person is rational if what they believe is internally consistent, it makes sense, and also it's consistent with what is known about the world around them. And in those terms, belief in witchcraft was entirely rational, belief in demon possession was entirely rational, and most of the other things that you've described were equally rational. People had evidence for these things, but perhaps the evidence was not the kind of evidence that we would accept today. The obvious example that I mentioned already is the authority of Scripture. People knew that there were evil spirits because if you learnt one thing at all from the New Testament, it was that there were evil spirits, because, as I said, Jesus' main kind of miracle in the Gospels is the expulsion of bad spirits from the bodies of people afflicted with demons. If you don't accept that, then you're rejecting a very large part of the ministry of Christ. So that kind of evidence was accepted by educated people who knew the Scripture. Another example is the idea of witches being able to fly at night. Pretty much everybody accepted that in principle this could happen, and this included people who didn't believe in witchcraft in particular cases. They still accepted that in principle, yes, of course, witches could fly. How did they know this? They knew this because in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus himself is lifted up to the top of the temple by the devil, an invisible spirit. So it was known that spirits could elevate bodies into the air, and therefore, in principle, at least, it was possible for witches to fly because they were conveyed through the sky by evil spirits. So the knowledge of the world that people had allowed them to think in different ways to us, but their thinking was no less rational than ours.
When you look at some of the histories of and some of the mysteries of things like the lycanthrope, the werewolf, where do you start to find references of that in history?
You can find lycanthropy in the Middle Ages, and historians have a weird sense of when things happen. So the Middle Ages are roughly 500 to 1500. Anything after 1500 is modern, so what I do is modern. And in the later part of the medieval period, you get accounts of lycanthropy. In the 16th century, they are far less common than accounts of witchcraft, but they do crop up. And there are also connections between people accused of witchcraft and lycanthropy because it was believed often that witches could transform themselves, presumably through the powers of dark spirits, into other things. They could turn into animals, they could turn into hares, they could turn into wolves, they could turn into foxes. So that's part of popular knowledge of witchcraft. Educated men tended to be rather suspicious of this idea of transformation, and they were suspicious mostly because they doubted that it was possible for a human soul to inhabit the body of a different kind of creature, because they thought that human souls had been made by God to inhabit human bodies. So the notion that a person could turn into a hare was regarded as improbable by educated people, not because they thought it's patently an absurd thing to happen, but because of this theological objection about the nature of the soul. So these people are thinking in very different ways to us, but they are, as I said before, thinking rationally. And some of the things they knew about the world excluded possibilities that perhaps we would accept, and sometimes they permitted possibilities that we would not accept. So an educated person like James VI, King of Scotland, later King of England, accepted completely that it was possible for witches to fly through the air because he knew that devils could transport them. But also, he didn't believe it was possible for witches to turn into animals because he didn't believe that a human soul could be placed inside the body of another kind of thing. So people were reasoning in this way with the knowledge they had and coming to conclusions that we might find alarming, but to them made complete sense. And you had to be very well educated to think in this way as well. So lots of the accounts that survive of all of this stuff are not what we might think of as peasant superstition, and they are certainly not hysterical accounts. They are often very closely reasoned, indeed turgidly argued, and rather tedious texts that systematically work through the various possibilities and come up with conclusions like, yes, of course, witches can fly. This is how it happens. No, of course, witches can't turn into wolves. This is the reason why. So within the knowledge of the time, people were reasoning to conclusions that we might find absurd, but they weren't doing so because they were superstitious. They were doing so because they believed things that we no longer believe.
You know, something that's always fascinated me with the idea of lycanthropy is what we know about the idea of remote viewing at this time. And I know that in some of the gypsy cultures and in some of the witchcraft cultures, they have familiars. They're animals that they feel psychically or mentally linked to. And whereas the soul may not inhabit these creatures, I often wonder, can we make a connection with, you know, we have connections with loved ones. We can get that feeling that something's wrong and know it. Can they make these connections with animals, or at least in their imaginative consciousness, did they believe that they were, so therefore in essence they were transforming, but not necessarily physically, more in a mental state to these animal forms and able to see and experience things through them in what would have been like an original form of remote viewing?
You do get accounts sometimes from Scotland and occasionally in England and more often I think in mainland Europe of witches confessing actually to transformation into animals. Some of this stuff is dubious because many of these confessions were obtained under duress. But in some cases, it does seem that witches believed they really could do these things. What's much more common, however, particularly in the English-speaking world, is the association between witches and these things that were sometimes called familiar spirits after a passage in the King James Bible, but which ordinary people referred to as bugs or imps. And these were closely identified in English, and I expect also in colonial American witchcraft, with harmful magic. People would protect themselves against these nasty little bugs that they believed could come skittering down the chimney or perhaps enter in windows and through the doorway and could do them harm. And lots of those cases of demon possession that I talked about earlier that were linked to witchcraft involved these nasty little bugs actually getting inside people's bodies. There are plenty of accounts of people lying in bed at night and feeling this thing sort of scuttering up the side of the bed, and then suddenly they're possessed, and there's this thing inside them like a parasite. And that seems to be something like a witch's imp. And that connection in English and North American witchcraft is tremendously strong. Where you get witches in popular culture, at least in England and North America, normally they are attached to these nasty little bugs called imps. Now, quite what they were, no one is sure about. They may have been demons in the popular imagination. They may have been a kind of nasty fairy. They could be a species of wicked fairy. We don't really know. But what we do know is they were very closely connected in the popular imagination to witchcraft.
Dr. Darren Aldridge, our guest, will return with more on Darkness Radio. Because our own Tim from the Darkness Radio show here had an experience. Tim, this will be the creepiest moment of anybody's night is this next story, I can guarantee you. Tell people what happened to you last night.
Oh, about 4 a.m, Dave. I sleep very lightly, first of all, because I have 2 herniated discs in my back, and I'm laying on my side, like I normally do on my left side. In my right ear, I feel and I hear a scratching, like something crawling across my eardrum. And I basically said, "What the bleep is that?" And I kind of shot up out of bed, and I went to dig for it, and I felt it again. Only, not only did I feel it skittering across my eardrum and this sound, right? But I feel it start to burrow into my ear.
Oh.
So at this point, I get mad. I'm not freaked out. I'm mad. I go to the bathroom. I pour a cup of water and I slam it in my ear and try to shake it out. It doesn't come out. I refill the cup, slam it in my ear again, try to shake it out. Doesn't come out a second time. So I take a Q-tip, try to grab it with the Q-tip. Nothing comes out the first time. Second time, I pull out a small spider on the Q-tip, and it's all curled up, probably from having washed it out.
Help me!
Yep.
Help me! Well, Tim, that was just my familiar. I was just sending him over to get into your head to tell you that I want really cool Christmas presents this year. That's all I do is I send little insects. You didn't know about this?
No, I had no idea. Wow.
A spider in your ear.
Yeah.
Crawling about. So
First
obviously, we're both going to start sleeping with nylons over our heads.
Yes.
From now on, because it's the safest way to go.
I've already ordered mine.
So you think back in the day, Dr. Aldridge, that would have been a sign of witchcraft and chicanery going on?
It could be, or it could have been someone with a spider in their ear.
Stop
it. Really
it.
Depended upon
right.
the context.
Right.
Because people did not accuse their neighbours willy-nilly of this kind of nasty thing. They needed to tell a plausible story, a story that made sense. They needed to have some kind of affliction that was difficult to explain naturally, and many things could be explained naturally, but some things less easily. They also needed someone who was a plausible suspect, that is to say, somebody who had a reputation, often extending for many years, for practicing harmful magic. And lastly, and crucially, they needed to have some reason to believe that this person had a grudge against them, and they might wish to send the skittering spider to torment them in the night. Now, if those three things came together, and they didn't often, but if they did come together, then it was possible to make a more or less plausible case for maleficia. That is to say, an attack using harmful magic, or perhaps sending out some unpleasant little spirit, like a spider. When those things fell into place, a person might plausibly be accused of witchcraft. What would normally happen then is some attempt at counter magic. That's the normal response, because this was a magic-believing culture, as I've said already. So the typical way that people dealt with such attacks was not to go to the authorities, but to go to the local cunning man or cunning woman, who would then try to identify the witch or confirm the suspicions of the person who thought they knew who the witch was, and then practice counter magic to try to prevent this nasty creature from skittering down the chimney and onto your bed and into your ear in the middle of the night. And there are various types of protective magic available. One of the most common was something that is now called a witch bottle. You could have a bottle that was filled with urine and pins and then sealed up and placed strategically at the entrance of a bedroom or other thresholds, like under windows or under hearths, where nasty little creatures might skitter down and get inside. And this protective magical bottle filled with urine and pins would keep these creatures at bay. That was the theory anyway. And this is the way that most people, I think, most of the time, dealt with supernatural assaults of this kind. It's only really as a last resort that people go to the courts, because people were perfectly well aware that it was very, very difficult to prove what was essentially an invisible crime. It came down to one person's word against another. It was a very hard thing to prove, and consequently the law was very seldom involved in cases of witchcraft. And when it was, what you tend to find is the person has been accused not only of some act of maleficia, allegedly in the recent past, but they've been accused by others the year before that, sometimes decades into the past. These people have settled reputations for harmful magic.
Well, I would think
presumably that means that they were getting away with it.
I would think that once you suspect somebody is a witch or performing evil and witchcraft on you, I would think the last thing you would want to do is bring them to court.
Absolutely.
Because if they've already proven that they have abilities that can hurt you, if you are going to take them to court, them snuffing you out should be no problem.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. These people evoke fear, and in some cases, one suspects deliberately, they're trying to leverage a little bit of authority in communities where they don't have much, because they tend to be marginal people, they tend to be poor compared to people who accuse them. And I suspect that in many cases they are cultivating reputation for this kind of magical power in order to get a little bit of influence over people who are a bit better off than themselves. And as you say, of course, the last thing you want to do is upset a witch, because a witch might do you or your family harm. What people would try to do is practice counter magic, as I've said, or they might try to reconcile themselves to the person that's done them harm. And of course, all of this escapes the record. Well, all we have to speculate on are those few cases that are brought to court with a backstory. And it's when you look at the backstory that you can discover often 5-10 years of grievance and suspected maleficia and partial reconciliation and counter magic and all the rest of it. But all of this only comes to the surface when legal records are preserved, which means that someone actually is brought to court. But as you say, that didn't happen very often. And in most cases in England, certainly in the depositions that survive, witches were acquitted anyway. So people knew that it was really hard to bring a successful prosecution, so what's the point of going to the expense?
The whole idea of the supernatural and all of the different belief systems, and as you said, it wasn't irrational. They were as rational as we are at the time with the information that they had. It was what it was. Did you find, though, were you surprised in your research of the church's stance on this, the monarchy, any of that, how they responded to these type of claims? Did they feel that they were above it, or did they feel that there was, that even they had things to fear?
I think that fear of harmful magic is a very personal fear, and people might adopt theoretical positions such that this is impossible, you shouldn't worry about it. But in the deeps of the night, when you hear that skittering noise beside your bed and you feel something going in your ear, then perhaps it's a bit different, okay? What happens in England is that mostly Protestant monarchs and Protestant ministers are skeptical and disapproving of allegations of witchcraft. And the reason that they are skeptical and disapproving is that they have a very high doctrine of the power of God, and they regard magic as possible, they regard witchcraft as possible, but they think the suitable response is not to try to blame your misfortune on some poor old woman who's practicing magic, but to look to yourself for whatever sin you might have committed that has allowed God to punish you in this way. So for that reason, there isn't really much encouragement from the authorities in the English-speaking world for the prosecution of witches. The exception to this is twofold. First of all, if someone was believed to be conjuring dark spirits, then that's no longer a crime against one's neighbours, it's a crime against God. That kind of behaviour is condemned in the Bible. So that's something that people might theoretically be punished for, although ordinary people weren't so bothered about that. They were much more worried about nasty little insects sort of creeping into their beds or whatever. And the other circumstances in which allegations of witchcraft in the English-speaking world might really catch fire, so to speak, is when social order broke down and the normal mechanisms of judicial authority fell into abeyance. And the classic instance of this, of course, is during the first of the English civil wars between 1642 and 1645, when towards the end of the war in the eastern counties, there is a horrendous witch hunt. And I think you can actually use the phrase witch hunt to describe what happened in 1645, when a man called John Stern and his associate Matthew Hopkins were travelling the eastern counties, actively looking for people suspected of witchcraft and dealing with these people who perhaps had been undealt with for many years previously because the authorities were reluctant to act against them. Once the normal mechanisms of law and order broke down, people like Stern and Hopkins were able to step in, and in 1645, perhaps, well, at least 100 people were executed for witchcraft in that part of England, and it may be as many as 150, we'll never know. So when the normal mechanisms are not operating, then yes, you can have these really terrifying witch hunts. But that was very much the exception in the English-speaking world, and happily that applies also to North America.
Dr. Darren Aldridge will continue with us right after this. When we're speaking to English-speaking, proper English-speaking people, tonight's going to be the night I just can't put anything together. It's always that way. All right, we're talking now with Dr. Darren Aldridge, and we'll have a link up to his Amazon page, all of the great books that he's written. You said off air, you were chatting, you have an interesting devil story for us. Could you go ahead and share that with us at this point?
Oh, I think we should finish with the devil, as I started with the devil, and the devil is never far from my heart. And what happens in England in the 16th and the 17th century is that the devil becomes increasingly associated with temptation. And this temptation often is invisible. It's a whisper in the night, it's a sudden stirring of your heart, it's a movement of temptation in other parts of your body as well. That's how the devil works. But in popular culture as well, there are lots of stories of the devil just turning up as an unexpected visitor and presenting you with temptation. And one story that occurs to me now is of a woman in the 1670s in Shoreditch, which is a part of London, who was impoverished, living with many children that she wasn't able to look after adequately. And one afternoon she was visited by this hooded stranger who just appeared from nowhere, it seemed, in her front room. This man spoke to her kindly and softly and said, "I can see that you are suffering and struggling. Do you want me to help alleviate your pain?" And the woman says yes, and the man produces a knife from his pocket, and he tries to press the knife into the woman's hand and says, "You can use this to remove one of your children, and if you do this, you will live more contentedly." And the woman screams, she runs out into the street, Her neighbors hear her bellowing. They come to her aid, and then they see the hooded figure drift out of the house. And in the witness descriptions that survive, the people say that this figure did not move as men do move, but he glided down the street. And it was subsequently assumed that this figure must have been the devil coming personally to tempt this poor woman, and luckily she overcame his horrible suggestions.
When you're talking about the devil stories, I grew up in Chicago, Illinois,
Yep.
and one of the stories that always came out that I always thought was so interesting and fascinating at the same time, especially in the time frame that it took place on Archer Avenue.
Yeah.
It's very famous. Many people know of all the ghost stories along that, but there's a ballroom along Archer Avenue in Chicago where the devil is claimed to have come to dance. And it was in a local tradition in Bridgeport neighborhood. They recall this kind of weird supernatural event that occurred at Kaiser Hall, which is it's just west of Loomis Street on Archer. And the story tells that a young woman kind of became entranced one night when she was with this kind of handsome, dashing stranger that she had met out on the dance floor. And as they were dancing the night away, she happened to glance down near the end of the night at the stranger's feet, and her cries of pleasure ended up turning into these horrified screams. Assuming the stranger had made an inappropriate advance towards the girl, a lot of the neighborhood men started to get very angry and start to come to her side. And they ended up being surprised. He refused to fight him and instead managed to get himself cornered near a second-story window. And it was at that point he leapt out of the window and surprised everyone by landing on his feet on the sidewalk below. And when the crowd rushed to the window to watch him, they discovered him running away. And the folks in the neighborhood said that the man had cloven hoof, that he had that. And, here it is. Yeah. And that was in the culture. I think it was like the 30s or 40s this took place in the Chicagoland area. And there are many witnesses to this story. Yeah. Unlike a fantasy fable where one person knew a person who saw a guy who heard about this story, this was a well-documented, very strange case.
Oh, yeah, and that's absolutely typical. It's a nice example because it's so late, but the records of the 17th century in England abound with tales like this, and they are always well attested because the people who publish these stories know that people don't day-to-day expect to encounter the devil, so you need persuasive evidence, you need lots of witnesses to testify that what is described really took place. And so typically these accounts will include lots of witnesses who describe this mysterious gliding figure or this figure with hooves instead of ordinary feet, or this figure with other extraordinary powers like being able to jump up a chimney or whatever. So there's lots and lots of documented eyewitness accounts of the devil, and he turns out mostly to be a dashing and seductive young fellow who comes maybe not as an angel of light, but as an attractive proposition, but is always exposed in this way, and often before many witnesses. So there's lots of evidence for the devil if you look for it. What you make of this evidence, I'll leave that to you and your listeners to speculate upon. As I said at the start, all we can really say with confidence about the devil is what people have believed about him.
I'm curious, as we're going to go into the world of King Arthur for the next few hours on the show, I've got to guess that there had to be some of the twisted histories that kind of crossed into that, especially when you're talking about characters like Merlin and sorcerers. And a lot of the kings, from my understanding, actually had practitioners on their courts that would, cast spells of protection, cast spells for war, and do things along that line. Did you find that to be true, or again, does that just kind of fall into the realm of fantasy and fable?
Potentially, skillful magicians could be quite lucrative for their employers, particularly alchemists who proposed to turn base metal into gold. So occasionally these people would be employed in courts, and Elizabeth kept her own alchemist, a man called John Dee, who had some influence over government policy. Going back to the Arthurian stuff that you're coming to next, I mean, one figure from those stories that survives strongly in the 16th century in England is Merlin, because there are many prophecies attributed to Merlin that are still circulating and indeed being added to and invented long into the 18th century. Merlin remains a stock figure in the literature of magic, and people would buy little chapbooks of Merlin's prophecies to see what was going to happen to the world next. So these figures do linger, surprisingly and strongly, in what we call early modern English magical culture.
Well, we've had a pleasure speaking with you tonight, Dr. Oldridge, and I hope as you continue to bring out new books, you'll keep in touch with us and allow us to visit with you again in the future.
It's been a delight, Dave.
Well, I thank you.
And beware the spiders.
Yeah. I'll leave Tim alone for a little bit. I won't send my little familiar bugs his direction. Have a great night, and thank you for staying up late with us this evening, sir. Thank you. Take care. All right, Tim, King Arthur, legend and lore, that's always been such a fascinating point for me. I loved Sword in the Stone when I was a kid, and then Excalibur in the 80s. Did you ever see that movie?
I did, yeah.
Oh, man, I love that flick. I must have watched that about 20 times growing up, and I was always so fascinated by the idea of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And then, of course, as you get older, your changes turn, and suddenly I'm into Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But I just love the whole idea of this, but always grew up with the understanding and belief that King Arthur was nothing more than a fable. And now as I get older and I start to do more research into the historical aspects of these stories, it seems that characters like Robin Hood and King Arthur and Merlin and the Knights of the Round Table, these may have real roots in history. This isn't just something so easily swept away. And I never knew that. It's only been in the last few years that this has come to my attention.
Yeah.
So I was fascinated. Our next guest will be joining us when we come back. Graham Phillips, his new book, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, The Search for Camelot and the Isle of Avalon. That's next on the best in paranormal talk radio. Stay right here. This is Darkness Radio. Back. This is Darkness Radio. I'm Dave Schrader. That's Tim Dennison. Tim, I'm having a big issue.
What's that?
But before we get in with our guest, Graham Phillips, I need a good demonologist or an exorcist.
Really?
Yeah, because I have had, since Prince's death, in constant play rotation inside my brain, Purple Rain. No matter what. And I can listen to other songs while I'm on, listening in the radio on the way into the station or on the way home. But all I'm hearing is Purple Rain.
Really?
You get out. It's like the most strange infestation I've ever had. And I bought it. I bought the Prince MP3, Purple Rain album, so I could listen to it. I figured maybe I'd get some of the other songs ingrained back into my brain, push that one out.
Yep.
It's not. It just won't go away. It's there constantly, drilling. I said if his estate got paid for every time that replayed in my brain, I would have made him a billionaire in just the last week.
Oh, God, yeah.
It needs to stop. How do I get it out, Tim?
Download his other albums?
I've tried. Nothing's working. I've tried every kind. I listen to Springsteen. I've listened to Duran Duran. I've even gone to Wham! Anything to get this song out of my head. It won't go, Tim. You know what I need to do?
What's that?
Change my paradigm.
Oh.
You know how we do that?
How do you do that?
Well, I guess we can all go to the Paradigm Symposium coming up in a couple of weeks here in the Twin Cities. Scotty Roberts joining us right now. Scotty, will they have answers? Can Eric Von Daniken get this damn song out of my head?
I think the first answer would actually be in the form of the question. It would be, Wham?
Sometimes desperate measures, my friend.
I guess.
Yeah.
I guess so.
You've got the you've got the Paradigm Symposium coming back to the Twin Cities, and it will be the weekend of, what is it, the 12th, 13th, 14th?
And the 15th.
And the
Sunday
15th.
The 15th is the last day.
Wow.
4 days, Thursday through Sunday, same as every year. And we've got quite a load of excellent speakers this year. And we're going to be held at if you're local to the Twin Cities and you know St. Louis Park, over by Highway 100 and Highway 7 is the Templar Lodge. And we're going to be held in there at pretty fancy digs. Very cool setting for some of the things that we're going to be having going on. So,
who are some of your guests that we can expect to see this year?
Well, let me give you a quick rundown.
Okay.
I'll just start with our keynote speaker is going to be somebody that may not be a household name, but he's very big in his field, and it's Lon Milo Duquette. And Lon Milo Duquette, since '75, has been kind of this international governing officer of the Ordo Templi Orientis. It's kind of a religious and fraternal organization founded in the early part of the 20th century, and it has to do with the Masons and the Templars and all of that. And Lon is he's a folk musician, but he's somebody who has spent many years and written many books kind of putting humor a bit into the very serious topics of hermetics, ancient occultism. And by the way, occult is always a word that throws people. It doesn't always mean Satan.
No.
Occult has to do with ancient mysteries.
Right.
And so he's been working with that, and he writes a lot about Aleister Crowley. So he'll be a very interesting speaker, especially at this setting. We've also got some other very familiar names. We've got Scott Walter is going to be here. You've had him on your show, Scott
Right.
Walter from America Unearthed and Pirate Treasure of the Knights Templar. And he just told me yesterday that he has reached his 32nd degree in the Masons as well as a Knights Templar, and he's got some very interesting information he's going to share. So don't let the whole Templar Masonic thing, some people go, ooh, but don't worry about that. This is good stuff and good information that's coming out. If I give you a very quick rundown of our speakers, we've got Randall Carlson, who you may also know. He's with Sacred Geometry International. We've got Travis Walton, very well known to you. Travis, if you saw the movie, which this ages us, it came out 20 years ago.
Wow.
Fire in the Sky.
Sure.
And with D.B. Sweeney played his part, but it's about the Arizona logger that was taken up, abducted by a UFO. It remains one of the most controversial UFO abduction cases out there. And he's got a new documentary called Travis that we're going to be viewing at the symposium. We also have Richard Dolan, again known to you, a historical. I think Richard has always said he prefers to be known as a researcher and a historian, but he's really found his niche in the UFO territory. And you're more reasoned side of that. Along with him is Peter Robbins, who wrote the book Left at East Gate. Or was it East at Left Gate? I can't remember off the top of my head. But the big Rendlesham incident, and he's written a follow-up book to that.
And the Rendlesham UFO incident, again, one of the most well-documented and famous UFO stories. And boy, that is one that I almost think is bigger and more impressive than the Roswell story.
I do too, especially with all the information that comes out of that. And there's a lot of things that out of the Rendlesham case that people think, that's a little dubious, but you got to dig into it a little deeper, like the binary codes and the stuff like that. But you're right, this is one of the most documented on a military base, nonetheless. So he's going to be talking about that and other things related to that. We've got Micah Hanks. He is best known with the Graylian Report and his books, The UFO Singularity and the Ghost Rockets and things like that. He's a futurist for as young as he is. And so he's going to be here. The very prolific Nick Redfern, who is probably, while we are speaking, pumping out another 72,000-word book. And I think he's got about 50 or 500 books out there.
Every week I get a new press release. He's releasing his new book, and holy cow, that guy's one of the hardest-working authors I know.
I got to tell you, it's all he does. I wish I had time to write like he does. We've got Laird Scranton. I don't know if you've ever had him on your show.
No.
But he wrote a few years back a couple of books on the Dogon, the tribe in West Africa. And he really is into cosmology and language, but don't let your eyes gloss over. He shows how all of these things relate to a lot of these other alternative fields. And so he's very much the scientific thinker on this. We've got Dr. Rita Louise, who's written a book on myth and how mankind, man-made, I think it was called, on the myths that we create in religion and everything else, and she's a very interesting speaker. We've got somebody new to the paradigm, which is Jeffrey Dougherty. He does a radio show called The Christian Whistleblower, and Jeff used to be a charismatic or Pentecostal preacher, very much into the Jimmy Swaggart back in the day and things like that. And he has come out and found in his research very different interpretations of the New Testament and very different ways in the language. And so he's become the Christian whistleblower, and he presents a lot of very unique information. Aliens, reincarnation. He wrote a big book called The Apostle Paul Antichrist, in which he details some of the historic theories that say the Apostle Paul, who wrote 2/3 of the existing New Testament, probably hijacked that all from Christianity, and he was really a Herodian, or King Herod, the puppet king of Israel during the time of the Roman era. And so it's very interesting stuff he presents. We've got a very dear friend of mine. You may also know Dan Madsen. Dan is, I think I bumped into him again after not seeing him for about 12 years at one of the Darkness Radio events at the Stanley Hotel a few years back, 2008 or 9. And we hadn't talked in 10 years, and I bump into Dan. And Dan became very well known for kind of the other side of all of this research. He went the pop cultural way, and he started by publishing the Star Trek Official Fan Club magazine, which was picked up by Gene Roddenberry, called him, and Paramount. He got the first license. He did the Star Trek Communicator magazine, ended up meeting Spielberg, did all the Indiana Jones magazines, the Star Wars Insider magazines. He did the Lord of the Rings magazines, and now he works for HerUniverse.com after I think he sold off his empire.
Wow.
We've got a good friend of yours and mine, Sarah Soderlund, who is a psychic media. That's how I first met her, again at a Darkness Radio event, I think in 2007 at the Stanley again. And she is a doctoral candidate right now for her forensic psychology. So she's going to be talking about all of that stuff, mysteries of the mind.
Very cool.
Got a good friend of mine, a working partner with me, Rocky Stucci. I do a radio show with him on politics, which I'm sure is one of the raging topics on your show, politics. And he's going to come and speak on, he's very much into the paranormal and some of his investigations, and also he speaks on bullying and things like that. And so he'll be a lot of fun. Wildflower, Jessamine Devereaux is going to be here. She's going to be kind of our resident psychic. She's going to be presenting some information. We have Edward Nightingale, who has done a yeoman's research on the Giza Plateau, the mathematics, and how this all actually fits into some of the stuff Randall Carlson with Sacred Geometry International is presenting. They've done work together, and how all these ancient sites have these ancient mathematical codes. And math, right away, I glaze over on.
Right.
Math. I can't add 2 + 2 is 4.
But they make this so fascinating and easy to digest and understand, and start to see these kind of codexes for yourself. This is awesome. And you got a fantastic lineup. And again, there are a few tickets. This is selling out pretty quickly. And if you'd like to come to the event, it's going to be the 12th through the 15th here in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, at the Templar Lodge. That's pretty amazing. That's a pretty neat place. And I'm going to tell you this, for your listeners alone. Okay. I'm going to give a phone number here. All right. This is the phone number, 651. All right. 468-8115. If your listeners call me instead of going to the website, I will give them 50% off their tickets. Wow, 50% off. That's now, a pretty we've only got really technically about 30 seats left open, so they're going to go fast over the next 2 weeks. Sure. And for the hall that we're in, it's a little smaller hall. And I do have to mention, I'll be speaking, and my partner in crime, my friend, British archaeologist John Ward, he and his wife have the big site of Gebel El Silsila in Egypt, and I spent a lot of time over there with him, and we've written a couple of books, and he and I are going to speak together as well. Where can they find more information about the symposium? They can go to ParadigmSymposium.com. Paradigm. All the information. Symposium.com, and we'll have that up on our site as well. Give Scotty a call, 651-468-8115. That's 651-468-8115. Tell them you heard about it on Darkness Radio. Save 50% off on the remaining 30 or so tickets that they have. So take advantage of that. We'll see you there. We'll have a Darkness Radio booth set up. I think Sonia will be manning that for us, as Tim will be out of town. I'll be out of town. But go out and check out the Paradigm Symposium coming up soon. All right, stay tuned. When we return, Graham Phillips and the Lost Tomb of King Arthur. Here, search for Camelot and the Isle of Avalon. Our guest this evening, Graham Phillips, a former radio journalist and BBC broadcaster. He's a historical investigator, and he's the author of 13 books, including The Templars and the Ark of the Covenant, Merlin and the Discovery of Avalon and the New World, The Chalice of Magdalene, and The End of Eden. He lives in England. He's joining us tonight live on Darkness Radio. Thank you for joining us this evening, Graham. It is my pleasure. What a fascinating topic. You know, I grew up, as Tim and I were discussing in the last hour, I grew up fascinated by the King Arthur legend and thinking it was just that. And what a great story and kind of a parable for the way friendships could work and man's fortitude and strength and the way it all comes together. And then to start peeling back these layers and realize that there may be a real historical figure behind this story was totally new to me. I had no concept that there was anything based in reality. What do you find? What's the oldest reference to King Arthur?
Well, the actual stories that you were talking about were written from around about 1150 onwards. And they are the mythical king who fights dragons, rescues damsels in distress, the laws of chivalry and romance and so forth. But 300 years before the earliest of these so-called Arthurian romances was written, a British monk by the name of Nennius wrote a history of Britain, and he wrote it around about 830 AD. And in this, he refers to King Arthur as an actual historical figure who had lived 300 years before his time. So that's the earliest complete sort of reference to Arthur, although earlier than that, you've got a couple of mentions of his name, which don't tell us anything about him. So 300 years before the earliest stories of Arthur were written, 830 AD, you've got a man saying Arthur was an historical figure 300 years before he lived. So his time that Arthur is supposed to have lived, he tells us, is around 500 AD.
And not exactly understanding your culture and history as well as I wish I could, I would have thought that anybody bearing the title king, there would be copious records and acknowledgement of his existence. At that time, were kings basically mayors? I mean, would it be the equivalent of what we have as mayors or governors here in the United States? So they come and go so much you might not know everyone that ever bore the title king?
I suppose in a sense they would be like governors. But what you have to realize is that Britain, until the early 400s, had for 300 years or more been ruled by the Romans. So they were a part of the Roman Empire. But then in 410, the Roman Empire was collapsing. The troops were withdrawn from Britain. And very quickly, the country fell into a state of anarchy. I mean, imagine any country in the world today when all the police and the army they all suddenly disappeared. It wouldn't be long before that country broke up into separate units. And Britain broke up into a number of separate tribal kingdoms. And there were dozens of them. And so Britain, by the time Arthur is said to have lived around 500 AD, is divided into separate kingdoms, each of them with a chieftain who would call himself a king. So it's not a king like in the medieval sense, a man with a crown who rules the whole of Britain. It's a person who is a chieftain referred to as a king who rules a place the size of, say, a modern American county or something.
Okay. All right, yeah, so it is almost like a mayor for that village or that town, the leadership of that. With such sparse information that exists out there about this character, what can you tell us? Who was King Arthur?
Well, it's quite a complicated procedure to try and work out who he really was. We know from Nennius that he tells us firstly that what you have to do first, I think, is to understand what's happening in Britain at 500 AD. The country's in anarchy. There's all these different little kingdoms fighting each other. And into this disunited land comes an invader. Now, the invader are the Anglo-Saxons. Now, they come from Germany. Now, most people tend to think of the English and English culture and English-speaking world as descended from Anglo-Saxon culture. That's true, but the Anglo-Saxons didn't originally come from England. They came from northern Germany. And they began to invade Britain, the east of Britain. And it is the Britons themselves, the native Celtic people, who are fighting these Anglo-Saxon invaders. Eventually, the Anglo-Saxons managed to beat them. But at the time Arthur is said to have lived, it was at the height of a war between them. Now, Nennius tells us that Arthur is one of the last Britons to make a successful stand against the Saxons. In fact, when it looks like the Anglo-Saxons are about to cut the country in two and divide and conquer the enemy, so to speak, Arthur united the various dysfunctional British kingdoms into a single fighting unit that managed to push the Saxons back, almost out the country, but well back to the east of Britain, for some decades. So this is the historical Arthur, a unifying figure for the British kings or British chieftains in their struggle against the invading Anglo-Saxons.
Is there any chance, I mean, it's funny how so many of the stories that we get are from monks and these guys that had a lot of time on their hands. Is there any chance that they were being creative and an imaginative outlet for them was to create stories to either entertain themselves or the Brotherhood? Could there be some of this, that some of it was just completely fake information?
Yes, that's possible. The only problem is that these days anyone can write anything fake they want. They've got plenty of places to write online. And even before that, we've got plenty of paper and plenty of pens. What you have to realize that had happened in Britain in the Dark Ages, as it's called, after the Romans left, civilization virtually completely collapsed. And there was very little to actually write on. We got our paper, so to speak, from the Roman Empire and from the paper mills, if you want to call them that the Romans had installed here. These basically didn't exist anymore. So finding something to write on, you had to make it yourself to start off with, and actually something to write with. Also, you've got a situation where very few people are able to write. Learning and schools have gone. And the few people that do know how to write have got the time to do so and have got the means to write, something to write on, are monks who mainly wrote religious works. But some of them did, in fact, decide to put pen to paper and record the history. When every single letter that you have to write is written with ink you have to make yourself, with a feather pen that you have to make yourself, on paper you've made yourself, in rainy conditions inside a freezing cold monk cell. Personally, this is my own personal belief, I don't think they had an awful lot of time to mess around. The people who were writing were pretty serious about what they were writing about. The problem is there are very few of these writings that have survived till today, which is probably why many characters, not only Arthur, went unrecorded at that period.
If there was such a little bit of information that survived regarding this man, King Arthur, but he was such a uniting force and did what others had not been able to do for such a long time by bringing people together to fight for one cause and keeping that cause at bay, why don't you think there are more tales and more scripts and things that exist or have been passed down orally sharing the story of King Arthur?
Well, I think there were. Even though the earliest of these Arthurian romance stories was written in the Middle Ages, that's the story we know today about Arthur, there are a number of early ones. You asked me what the earliest one was, and that's this man Nennius telling us he was an historical figure. But between when he wrote in the early 800s and the early 1100s, when these romances are written, many stories do survive from Britain, written in the language that was spoken at that time, which is Brythonic, which evolved into modern-day Welsh, so we still can read these things. There were many stories written about Arthur, but he's not portrayed as this knight in shining armour, a king with a golden crown fighting with a broadsword and a lance and living in a great, huge Gothic castle. He's a more down-to-earth, blood and guts warrior fighting the Anglo-Saxons in a historical context. Now, the historical context is that rather than being a knight in shining armour, Arthur would have been a Roman-style figure. In other words, the nearest thing to imagine what he would have looked like and what his armour would have looked like and what his weapons would have looked like, think of a Roman and think of one who's in rather mucky clothes because, they're passing the armour on from generation to generation because the Roman Empire has collapsed. A mucky Roman is probably how you can imagine him. And he wouldn't have lived in a Gothic castle. He would have lived in the kind of fortifications that they had at that time, where a fort would have been surrounded by an embankment, a ditch, and on top of the embankment would be a wooden stockade with defensive towers. That's the kind of historical Arthur we're looking for. And he is recorded in quite a number of stories that have survived. In fact, when you consider that from the Dark Ages, very few records have survived about anybody, let alone stories. If you put all those stories together that have survived, at least half of them include Arthur in some way or another. And there are many historical figures we do know existed from foreign sources, people who came to Britain and then went home and wrote about it. who are not recorded by the Britons. So if you look at it in that way and say, well, if half the actual surviving stories about anybody written during the Dark Ages include King Arthur, he probably existed.
Graham Phillips, our guest, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, when we continue on Darkness Radio. A young king in this, nice armor wielding Excalibur and leading his men and troops into war and coming back to Guinevere in a beautiful castle. How do we go from grungy kind of Roman hand-me-down outfits and storyline to this romanticized version? Where did, just a great publicist for King Arthur, or how did this story evolve?
Well, in the Middle Ages, the period when these were written, when people were living in Gothic-style castles and kings that did look like we imagine Arthur to look lived, many stories were written about earlier periods, such as the legends of Greece and Rome or biblical stories. Well, the thing was that during the medieval period, there wasn't such a thing as the subject of history. There weren't really historians, and those that were didn't really know much about what had gone on. It was only later that people began to collect together documentation and earlier illustrations of what things looked like, and it was much later than that than we had archaeology. They didn't know what people dressed like at the time Arthur lived. They didn't know what people dressed like in the time of the biblical story. So legends of Greece and Rome were often set, for example, in the context of knighthood and chivalry. In fact, if you look at any picture that's painted in the medieval period of the crucifixion, say, for example, where you've got Roman soldiers standing around Jesus on the cross, they're all dressed in medieval armor. They don't look like Romans as we'd imagine it at all. They look like guys out of the 1300s or something. The reason is they had no idea. They could read in the Bible that the Roman centurion said such and such, and these Romans did this to Jesus. They didn't know what they looked like. They just knew they were soldiers. So the tendency was that at the Middle Ages to depict earlier times in context of their own. And this is what happened with Arthur. So they've got these stories that had survived, some factual accounts and some accounts that have been fictionalized and perhaps exaggerated, which they then start to talk about in their own kind of like historical period. So warriors become knights and they dress in the kind of plate armor that they had in the Middle Ages, and they fight with broadswords, and they live in the kind of castles that knights would have lived in the Middle Ages. So that's how this comes about.
Isn't that, it's fascinating. One of my favorite movies is A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger. And it sounds like this,
right, yes.
Right, here it's kind of the same thing. We're telling this story, but we're contemporizing it. We're adding our music and our lingo and language to the, this kind of classical tale of that. And that seems to be exactly what you're talking about. Is they reflected it with the knowledge of what they know now and marrying it with a story of what was, but kind of romanticizing it into a different context.
Yeah, I believe, if I remember rightly, The Knight's Tale, which was something that was written by Geoffrey Chaucer in the Middle Ages, when the film came out, they've got the music of Queen and David Bowie, and everybody's singing along to it.
Exactly, right. And that's what it feels like when you're talking to us about how they were doing it. It's this uniting of two different historical periods as we know it to make it a cohesive story, to make it interesting for people now.
Yeah, it's full of anachronisms. Shakespeare did this all the time. He's got Julius Caesar. There's a time they hear in one scene a clock chiming. Well, they didn't have clocks back in the time of Julius Caesar. They did in Shakespeare's time, so he brings one of those in. It's a lot of stories that were written throughout the ages are full of anachronisms. I remember Ben-Hur once. I don't think they intended this one. When Ben-Hur first came out, he was in one scene. He was wearing a wristwatch.
Yeah, the same thing happened in the Braveheart movie. They had they had to digitally edit when there's that big fight scene and they're all running. A bunch of the extras still had forgotten to take off their wristwatches. So they had to digitally paint them to look like gauntlets, or they had to just remove the image altogether. That's one of the more famous gaffes in movie history, I guess. So we hear how they kind of brought this up and made it more modern for them. But why, of all the characters of legend and lore, why does this man become so universally famous, do you think? Why does he stand out so far above everyone else? I mean, I'm sure there were other characters that must have had fascinating tales and must have been handsome and fit into these stories. Why King Arthur, of all the obscure references?
The reason is that he became something of a figure in a medieval propaganda exercise. Again, you've got to look back in the history of the context in which he's set. I mentioned to you that the Anglo-Saxons were invading Britain. And then by around the mid-600, 700, they had invaded all of what's now England. And England is actually named after the Anglo-Saxons, Angleland, England. The native Britons were pushed west into what we now call Wales, which is why they still speak a version of the language Brythonic, which was spoken throughout all of Britain before the Anglo-Saxons turned up. We, the English, speak a derivation of Anglo-Saxon, or Old English as it was called. So that's why we have different languages in this country. So the language that you're speaking in America is derived from Germanic Anglo-Saxon and really has very little to do with native British that was spoken before the Anglo-Saxons turned up. Okay, but these Anglo-Saxons were in turn invaded by a new set of people, for a while the Vikings in the north of England, and then eventually in 1066 by the French, specifically the Normans, who were from Normandy in northern France. They then became the kings and aristocrats of England. And the aristocrats all spoke French, and the ordinary people all spoke what we'd call English, Old English. So you've got two languages, two separate cultures. And what happened is that many of the native people were turning around and saying, we are the true rulers of this country. We have our leaders who can trace their ancestry back to the true kings of England. These people who are ruling this country now are Frenchmen. They've got no right to be here. So the kings of the French kings who ruled Britain needed their own heroic and majestic ancestor to say, we have descended from him and therefore we should rule here. Now, they had to look back to somebody who ruled this country before the Anglo-Saxons, because when the Anglo-Saxons came, many of the Britons fled into what's now northern France. So the Normans, the northern French, could claim descent from the native Britons. So they wanted somebody a native British king who had fought and beaten the Anglo-Saxons to say, we're descended from him, we've got more right to rule here than you have. And the nearest thing that they could find to a uniting king of all of Britain before the Anglo-Saxons in any record at all was this warrior chieftain, Arthur, who had united the Britons. And so consequently, they thought, great stuff. We've got ourselves a true king of the Britons. We can say we're descended from him. We've got a reasonable amount of evidence that we could be. And one particular British king, English king, got a man called Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 1130s to write a whole history of this man, King Arthur, and to prove what a wonderful man he was. Write everything you can and assemble all these various legends that have existed, put them all in one book, and we'll put that out as the truth about the man who was Arthur. And he was the first one to really not only put together all the historical stuff that still survived in the 1130s, he was the one who started the tradition of writing these romantic tales of portraying Arthur as a great and mighty, handsome warrior, making stuff up. And because the king was sponsoring this, and because the nobles really loved the whole idea of this Arthur that they could all claim descent from, the writers, the rich, the French in Britain, started writing more and more of these tales. And that's how Arthur became firstly a crucial figure in a medieval propaganda exercise and a bestseller.
Wow, fascinating stuff. We're going to continue with Graham Phillips, our guest, as we go for the search for Camelot and the Isle of Avalon, the lost tomb of King Arthur, when we continue on Darkness Radio. People start to forget that he was real and that he wasn't just fantasy. When did we start to break away from that moment?
Around about Shakespeare's time, because by then, when Shakespeare, until Shakespeare's time, people tended to believe whatever they read. Well, a lot of people do that these days, but when the internet was invented, they stopped doing it.
Right.
And Shakespeare was writing, and other people like him, but he started the whole tradition in the 1590s of writing about historical figures. But everybody knew that he was adding on his own interpretations and dramatizing the whole thing. Everybody realized that there was a truth behind the fact that Julius Caesar was assassinated by Brutus, but they knew full well that everything that Caesar did and what he was saying and how he acted and Brutus, how he behaved, that this was clearly being made up by Shakespeare. So they became aware of the dramatization of history. And Shakespeare wrote many histories, Richard III, King Lear, you name it. And people became aware then that there was, maybe these people really did exist, but, the line between fact and fantasy became, was very blurred when it came to theatre. And people began to see the same thing in the novels of the time. So from then on, people began to say, hold on a minute, this Arthur, he sounds a bit unbelievable. And of course, by this period, by the 1500s, 1600s, you've got the beginnings of science when people you've got Galileo in the early 1600s, then you've got Isaac Newton in the later 1600s. And people began to really question whether these things like dragons could have really existed and whether there were people who were witches and wizards like Merlin. And so gradually, with the advent of science and the age of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, people more and more began to look upon King Arthur as complete legend. He had a bit of a reprieve in the Victorian period, in the 19th century, when the painters started. There was a Gothic revival and new buildings were built in the style of old medieval castles, and paintings were painted of the Arthurian stories, and romantic poetry was written by people like Shelley and Keats and Byron and all the rest. And many of these people, poets, painters of that period, of the Victorian period, started to use King Arthur as inspiration. And so the whole thing became even more romanticized. And people began to write even more outlandish stories of King Arthur. They have him in one or two of the Victorian tales in a flying boat. Others bring in flying carpets, which clearly came from Arab tradition. And so by the time the era of film came about in the 20th century, Arthur had been pretty much romanticized out of all recognition as to how he started. It's two things. On the one hand, it's a massive problem because it means that most people say, well, there was no Arthur. He couldn't have done all these really weird things that he's claimed to have done in the stories. And historians will say, well, we're not going to get involved trying to find out who he was. He clearly didn't exist. And any that do, other people will laugh at them and say, what, you're looking for this man who flies around in boats and fights dragons? And so on the one hand, it stopped a certain amount of research being done into Arthur. But on the other hand, it's kept his legend alive. If he hadn't have been this medieval figure in a medieval propaganda exercise, if he hadn't become romanticized by the Victorians, he wouldn't be remembered today for anybody to even bother looking into him. So when I started investigating the story, there was the fact that he'd been romanticized was both a curse and a blessing.
Right. And again, I mean, it brings this great mystery and history to your culture and to the land. And right, it brings this fascinating fable forward so that it does kind of romanticize the idea of the times and what was going on. and drawing an interest to history that others, it may have been lost without that.
Well, if you want to know what it was really like to live in Britain in 500 AD, firstly, most people, their staple diet would be fobs. Do you know what fobs is?
I do not.
It's lumps of bread in sour milk. That's your breakfast, right?
Hot dog,
followed
right.
by weak beer. You couldn't drink the water because it would be poisonous. Well, it'd be infected because they boiled up beer and it fermented. It kept the germs out. So you'd have loads of horrible tasting beer. So you'd be absolutely out your face most of the time. You'd be eating fobs. You'd hardly ever have meat of any kind unless you could catch a squirrel or two. You could grow things, but think of the things that we enjoy today in Britain. Potatoes, well, we didn't have those. They came from America much later on. Carrots weren't anything like we have. Now,
wait. So potatoes,
turnips.
Potatoes were not a thing in Ireland. That didn't come from the Irish culture.
Potatoes were brought back to Britain by, it said, Walter Raleigh in the 1500s. Right. He discovered the Americans eating them. And do you know where the name potato came from? There was one of Walter Raleigh's people in Virginia, in the colony of Virginia, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, asked a translator, this girl who was a Native American, asked her what they called this potato, this thing they ate. She misunderstood and thought what they were asking her what her name was, and her name was Potato. That sounds silly now, but it wouldn't have done at the time. And she was telling them her name was Potato, and they said, "Oh, it's a potato." Well, once you told them that they got it wrong, the name had already stuck. So anyway, that's just I'm digressing. But potatoes, which is a staple diet of many people in this country even today, weren't introduced to Europe until the 1500s, so early 1600s. So we didn't have that. There were so many things we didn't have. We didn't have the kind of spices to spice up food. We didn't have pepper to put on it. Salt was in short supply. Food would have been bland. There'd be hardly any of it. It would be mainly barley stew and you drinking this horrible tasting beer that would make you sick. As for sort of the romance, well, most people had no way of washing or bathing or anything unless you lived near a river. And what about in the middle of winter when it snowed over? You're not going to go swimming in a river, so you'll stink most of the time. People's teeth would have fallen. The average age of people in Britain, and this was right up until the Victorian period, was not much older than 30. I'm an old, but by the time, if you got to 40, you would be a very lucky person. You'd have no teeth. They'd have all fallen out in the most horrendous way. Should I go on?
Well, you are. I can almost see a Fabio romance novel the way you're describing this.
But it basically, and everyone's fighting for their lives. I mean, I wouldn't wonder if I went back there. If I'd bother fighting for mine, I think I'd just lie down in the snow and try and reincarnate or something.
You're my kind of guy, Graham Phillips. That's exactly what I'd do. I'd join you in that. Oh, this seems like a lot of work. Let's just wait till the next lifetime. So
yes, I mean that's it. So I mean no. So life at that time would have been very, very different. But even in the Middle Ages, when we have the romances portraying these knights in armour, most people would have died of septicemia after a small cut in their hand. Wow. with a knife. They wouldn't have sort of been able to sort of take all these wounds that you see in the movies.
It's just a flesh wound.
Yeah, well, that will probably kill you. Get dirt in it. They didn't understand about that. You could have got septicemia. Tetanus killed thousands of people.
Interesting. We have to take our top of the hour break. We'll continue with our guest, Graham Phillips, for the next hour. Did Camelot exist? Is there actually a tomb of King Arthur? And what about some of the other legends? What about Excalibur? What about the Knights of the Round Table? And Merlin? We mentioned Merlin earlier. Did these characters exist in a historical context as well? If so, how did they fit into this story? And the Crusades looking for the Holy Grail, was there really a tie to the King Arthur story? And part of this, we'll talk about that and so much more as we go in search of the lost tomb of King Arthur, the search for Camelot, and the Isle of Avalon. Graham Phillips, our guest here on the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Darkness Radio. Night tonight. Graham Phillips, our guest this evening, as we talk about the King Arthur legend the lore, and the reality of the story. Our guest, a former radio journalist and BBC broadcaster. He's a historical investigator with over 13 books, everything from the Templar and the Ark of the Covenant, Merlin and the Discovery of Avalon and the New World, The Chalice of Magdalene, and The End of Eden. Our guest lives in England. He's up very late, or as we might look at it, very early to be here with us this evening. So thank you again for joining us, Graham.
My absolute pleasure.
Let's talk about some of the other legends. First of all, Camelot. Is this something that was part of the romanticized story, or was there a connection to the legendary land of Camelot actually connected to the Arthurian legends?
In the Arthurian legends, Arthur is said to have ruled from this magnificent city called Camelot, the capital of all England, all Britain. Now, one would say, if you're trying to look for a King Arthur behind the legend, which is what I set out to do originally about 25 years ago, I mean, the research I've done has been done on and off over a period of 25 years. And I've been able to do a certain amount of research, and then I've hit a brick wall because the historical documentation hadn't been discovered to take us the next step, or the archaeological, the science of archaeology hadn't reached the point of being able to do an excavation in the right kind of places to, fit the pieces of the jigsaw together. But the simple thing you would think to do if you're trying to look for an historical Arthur is, well, he ruled from Camelot, go and have a look at Camelot and find out what's there. The problem is there is no place in Britain today still called Camelot. In fact, there is no historical records that there ever was a place called that. In fact, the name Camelot was the invention of a 12th century French poet called Chrétien de Troyes, who had to think of a word to rhyme with Lancelot. I think it's like the Monty Python people saying Spamalot, or
right.
She makes me push the Pramalot. That's how the word Camelot came into being, as far as we can tell. There is certainly no reference to Arthur's place being called that before. However...
So a little poetic free license in creating the town or the village that he would be in charge of.
Yes, but he was in charge, apparently, of a magnificent city, the greatest in all Britain, because the earlier stories that I mentioned to you that are not so romanticized as those in the Middle Ages, the ones written during the Dark Ages, refer to Arthur as ruler of holding court in a magnificent city. The interesting thing is, none of them tell us the name of this city or where it is. It would appear that by the time these stories were written, a few hundred years after Arthur is said to have lived, the name of the place where he ruled from had been forgotten. So I was left with having to discover if Arthur really did live around 500 AD and really did rule from the most important city, where was this city? Where do we know that this city was from an archaeological perspective? Well, when the Anglo-Saxons were invading Britain in the 400s, there were four main British cities, the biggest cities in the country. They were old Roman cities that were still being inhabited by the native Britons. There was London, Lincoln, York, and Viriconium. Now, London, Lincoln, and York are all on the eastern side of Britain and were very quickly invaded and overtaken and overrun by the Anglo-Saxons, which left this city called Viriconium, which was smack bang in the middle of England, as effectively the capital of Britain. So that's where I decided to look for an historical King Arthur. And when you go to Viriconium now, it's about 4 miles to the east of a town in the middle of England called Shrewsbury. It stands outside a little village called Wroxeter, just with a few houses there. But unlike the other cities, London, Lincoln, and York, which were later modern cities, so if you wanted to do archaeological investigations to find out what Dark Age London was like, you'd have to dig beneath streets, office blocks, and apartment buildings. Whereas Viriconium still survives in open countryside, and therefore its ancient ruined walls can still be seen. Over 1,500-year-old ruined walls still standing in countryside. Now, this has meant that archaeologists have been able to excavate here and discover exactly what was happening at the time Arthur is said to have lived. And incredibly, when many other old Roman towns are being abandoned for more easily defensible hilltop sites, Viriconium was not only still being inhabited, it was a thriving city, it was growing, it was massively refortified. And right at the heart of it, archaeologists have discovered, there was a large palace built, a large residential building that seems to have been the seat of an immensely important warlord. And this is exactly the time that Arthur is said to have lived. So from the archaeological perspective, if there was an historical Camelot or whatever it was called, then Viriconium would probably be it.
Viriconium. All right. When you're digging in and you're researching that, now you see that there's something that is there. You know about this fortification. You would think that if something survived or some kind of history of that, why would there not be associated names to that time era?
The problem is that during the early Dark Ages, 400s, 500s, and the 600s, very few records have survived for us to examine today. The reason being, I mean, for example, when we talk about Nennius, the man who wrote in 830, it's only a fluke, really, that his book managed to survive. He talks about King Arthur fighting a series of successful battles. He tells us when he was around, and we know it's around 500. But he doesn't tell us that much about him. You go back earlier, and you've got a blank period where no one's writing hardly anything. We do have the writings of another monk called Gildas, who wrote within living memory of the period Arthur is said to have lived. He wrote in around about 545 AD, and he talks about Viriconium being an extremely powerful and important place, and the kingdom around it being the most powerful in the country at the time, around 500. So we know a bit, but we don't really know who ruled from here until a manuscript was discovered not too long ago in the British Library, which includes a series of genealogies, family trees of important British rulers. And it does tell us, incredibly, it does tell us who ruled from Viriconium at the time Arthur is said to have lived. In other words, whoever it was that archaeologists have discovered had built this impressive palace, this residence, had refortified and made Viriconium and made it such a prosperous place. We know his name. Now, when I first saw this, I was devastated because its name wasn't Arthur, it was Owen Llan Gwyn. The man's name was Owen, not Arthur. So at first I thought, oh, gosh, that's it. It's, there isn't an Arthur. But then I thought, well, okay, I found the man who probably united the Britons. So he's ruling from the most impressive place in the country. He's probably the man who united the Britons to kick the Saxons out. No one had done that before. So I kind of thought, well, that's all right. But it was when I was looking at this monk Gildas' writing, this is the one who wrote within living memory of this man Owen Llan Gwyn's time, that he refers to Owen Llan Gwyn, but he also refers to him by his battle name. Now, the Celtic people of Britain at this time, warriors, would be given or adopt the name of a real or mythical animal to some way represent their prowess, like the fox if they were cunning, the eagle if they could see ahead. This man, Owen Llan Gwyn, was called the Bear. Now, Gildas the monk wrote in Latin and calls him Ursus. But when you realise that in Brythonic, the language spoken in Britain at the time by the common person, which later evolved into modern Welsh, both in Brythonic and modern Welsh, in any Welsh dictionary, the word for a bear is arth, A-R-T-H. So the man who ruled from the most powerful city in the country at the time Arthur is said to have ruled from the most powerful city in the country was called Arth, which could probably very well have been Latinized into the name Arthur as the years went by. So I really believe I found the man behind the legend.
How all of these people fascinated by this, and I know there's been documentaries about this case. How is it that nobody else was able to stumble upon this history before or make these connections, and it opened up to you?
I was lucky because I came investigating this at the time that the Viraconium was being excavated. Until the 1990s, when I first started doing this research, there was the amount of work that had been done at Viraconium hadn't revealed that it had been reoccupied and was a major city in Britain in 500 AD. We didn't know that. So everybody was concentrating their efforts to look for Arthur, those that were investigating him, in the southwest of the country, a few hundred miles away, around places that had traditionally been associated with him in the Arthurian story of the Middle Ages. So the reason that no one had actually looked into this is because nobody knew that Viraconium was important until after the 1990s.
You've uncovered this bit of information. First of all, why have you not received knighthood for finding this stuff, Graham? That's what I want to know. You're able to prove that this existed, and you've got the connection, you've got the names. Why, with as popular as he is, why is this not exploding as much?
I think two things. One, the actual full story of everything has only just been put together. The book is only just out. You know, you talked about my book, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur. This is the book that is telling this story. Bits and pieces I've found over the years, and bits and pieces have occurred in different documentaries that have been made about my research. But no one really had a kind of overall picture as what I was finding out. So they'd say, well, this man thinks Camelot's here. Oh, that's interesting. And I'll give it a bit of explanation about that. And this man thinks that the Arthurian story is based on a real figure. They'll do a bit about that. It's never really been put together until now. I doubt if I'll get a knighthood, but at least somebody might turn around and say, Graham, come and visit the Queen.
That would not be a bad deal either, I guess. You're doing all this research. You're finding these bits of information. We've already talked about the fact that Camelot was just made up as more poetic license. What about some of the other famous bits of his history? You brought up Merlin earlier, and always one of the more fascinating characters because, again, who doesn't like a good wizard or magician? Talk to me about Merlin and the history and case for him.
Well, Merlin was somebody originally I thought was one of the most unlikely people to have been involved in the real story. I thought he was a medieval invention. But what is fascinating is in the stories about Merlin that were written from the 1100s onwards, Merlin is his title, just like, remember I said that the Celtic people used animal names to represent important people,
right,
particularly warriors. Merlin means an eagle. There's still a small eagle called a Merlin today. And it tells us that his real name was Ambrosius. Now, I spoke about the monk Nennius, who was the first person to give a complete description of Arthur and his battles in 830 AD. He also refers to a man called Ambrosius, who came to rule Britain just before the period that he places Arthur. Now, this man is recorded in documentation contemporary with the time he lived. And he was a man called Ambrosius Aurelius. He was of Roman descent. In fact, his great-great-great-grandfather was an emperor. If you've seen the film Gladiator, at the beginning, there's the good emperor who's played by Richard Harris. And that is the historical figure of Ambrosius Aurelius. And then so many generations later, you've got the Aurelius family settling in Britain. When the Romans left, after a few decades, it seems that one of them that stayed here, Ambrosius Aurelius, ends up commanding the British forces, whatever they were, in their fight against the Anglo-Saxons just before Arthur's time. Now, we don't know what happened to him, but for some reason he had to retire from active service. In other words, he's no longer a soldier, no longer a general. And he seems to become advisors to the British kings that followed, which is how it seems he became the Merlin in the Arthurian story as an advisor to Arthur. Now, whether he was able to do all these magical things or not is another question. But we are told that this Ambrosius spent the last years of his life as a bard. Now, a bard today, one tends to think of Shakespeare as the bard. It's a poet. But bards in the Dark Ages were attributed with prophetic powers and mysticism and so forth. The reason being that they were taught in a form of rhyming, which could become hypnotic. They were basically taught the techniques that today we would call hypnotism. They also knew and were taught by schools of bardic poetry and mysticism. They were taught about the herbal properties of plants. They actually knew what to give somebody if you wanted to get them to see visions. So they were kind of shaman as well as poets. So it's possible that the story of the shaman advisor to Arthur, Ambrosius, whose title was Merlin, who was perhaps able to hypnotize his audience or give them some hallucinogenic substance to make them see, well, perhaps the accounts of Arthur's subjects seeing dragons and witches may not have been totally made up. It may have been down to hypnosis and, well, drug abuse by Merlin. So, but he does, whatever he really did, this character that seems to have developed into Merlin in the Middle Ages really did exist. And he was a contemporary of Arthur.
Now, was there, in kind of taking off this topic for a few seconds, I know there are famous stories, even when we look into the biblical references, Pharaoh, some of the other leaders used to have wizards or sorcerers that were part of their entourage. And, right, I mean, during the plagues and the things that were coming down, that God was raining down on them, the sorcerers could replicate some of these afflictions and strange things that would occur. And they were also kind of advisors and these people that were part of it. Do you think that part of that bled into the story of turning him into this grand wizard as well?
Yes. I mean, I think what you have to realize is in modern culture, we read in ancient texts about what God or gods have told us to do. All religions are based on the fact that God or gods of some kind or other, or ancient spirits, have revealed their purpose for humanity, and it's been written down in ancient books. And we read these ancient books, and preachers tell us to look at this book, and so it says in the book of Exodus, or so it says in some other religious text. We have to ask ourselves when we're looking at history, how is God, or how are these gods talking to people? For example, if you look in the Bible, and you look in the book of Exodus, for example, and you say, and God said unto the Israelites, how is he doing this? We know that on one occasion, apparently, he descends upon Mount Sinai and talks to a booming voice. But most of the time, as the Israelites are pitching tent somewhere, and God spoke unto Moses saying, or God spoke unto the Israelites saying, or God spoke unto Samuel saying, how is he doing this? Is it in their own mind? Well, if we look at the way in which most ancient cultures go about this, like the ancient Greeks or Romans, they had oracles. They had people who were mediums, if you like, who would channel the gods or the spirits. And it seems that probably you've got some ancient prophet of the Israelites who's doing the talking for God, goes into a trance. You've perhaps got, and certainly we know in ancient Egypt that the priests in the temple would be doing the talking. So they'd stand beside the statue of the god and they would do the talking for the god. So in most ancient cultures, until Christianity developed and other religions, more modern monotheistic religions developed later on, most ancient cultures tended to have people whose job it was to channel the god, the gods, or spirits. And if you didn't have one of these people or an entourage of such people, you pretty much wouldn't be believed by the people you were trying to rule over. And I think this is probably the importance of Merlin. I think it's the importance of many of when we do know more about some of these characters in the Dark Ages, some of these rulers, they've all got these bards, these advisors, who probably also tell the future and channel whatever spirits or gods or saints they happen to believe in.
What a gig, right? I mean, what a job to get, because here you can say that this is what I think God wants, or you speak for the God that you're doing this for. So basically, you're leading the country. You're leading the leader by giving him this sage advice coming from the gods, and then if perchance it fails, it could simply be hung up on the fact that your faith was not strong enough, or right? I mean, wouldn't that have been kind of the out for most of these bards?
Well, this is exactly how Merlin is portrayed in the medieval romances. And if you've ever seen the film John Boorman's Excalibur, that is based on the real hardcore medieval romances.
Right.
And you can see Merlin in that. He is the real power behind the throne. He orchestrates the whole thing. And at the end of that film, like at the end of the romances, Merlin says, you know, the time of the old gods is over. My time is over. We're moving into a new era. No one will listen to people like me anymore. And he kind of fizzles away into the sort of the depths of time, so to speak. So, yeah, it would have been a good job until later, much stricter forms of Christianity came along and you ended up being burnt at the stake.
Right, for doing what had been okay even 50 to 100 years ago, right?
Precisely.
A strange changeover. We've got about 4 minutes left in this segment. I'm just curious, finding out, again, one of the more fascinating deals was this brotherhood that Arthur had that surrounded him. We know them as the Knights of the Round Table. And, you've got Lancelot as kind of his right-hand man and also tempted by Guinevere. And you've got these stories. What can you tell us about the Knights of the Round Table? Did they exist? Was this more like a council? How did this break down in real history?
Well, we know that the Celtic warriors, when they met to plan a campaign, would sit in a circle around a cauldron and drink what was in the cauldron, or feast what was in the cauldron collectively. And they sat in this circle so that no particular leader would be seen to be sitting at a more prestigious place than the others. So the story of the Round Table possibly came from this tradition. And some of the figures that are known as knights, not necessarily Sir Lancelot, but knights such as Sir Kay and Sir Percival, they are all seemingly based on figures that are associated with King Arthur, the chieftain, as warriors who surround him in the very earliest tales of King Arthur that haven't been romanticized. So there could have been something like a warriorship of the round circle of sitting people around a cauldron rather than Knights of the Round Table.
Yeah, that doesn't wax as poetic. The Knights of the Round Cauldron. And I would think that would even sound like it's got a tint to witchcraft involved. What about Galahad? I mean, are these characters also, you said Lancelot might not have fit into there. Was he more of the romanticized kind of, because again, you look at characters like that, if he doesn't really fit into the historical relevance of it, he's a great plot twist, right? He's a great character to infuse. Here you've got this loyalty to man and country, this loyalty to his king, and yet this forbidden love story and kind of the way it all came together, but yet he was still willing to, in love of his king and country, which sounds like parable to me, right? You're trying to show that no matter what, even in the face of true love, you have to choose what's right over all of that. And it seems like most of those characters might have been evolved into a parable to teach us.
That's true, but they actually evolved separately. Like Galahad, you mentioned, was already a figure, a knightly, romantic, heroic figure that existed in literature separate to Arthur in the Middle Ages. He got tagged onto Arthur. That's the same as what happened to Lancelot and other figures. The reason for this, it's sort of like Superman in the DC comics. They basically, and you have to add other DC characters to him because he's the best one. So we'll put Batman in there. We'll put Wonder Woman in there. And that's kind of what happened with Arthur in the Middle Ages.
Okay, so they connected other characters that had strong fortitude and a storyline and just kind of wove them into one universe.
Yeah, but there's about a quarter of the figures that appear in the Arthurian story that we know today that do seem to have been associated with him, although not as knights, but as warriors in the very earliest stories.
I could eat this stuff up. Fascinating guest. Graham Phillips, our guest this evening. The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, The Search for Camelot. and the Isle of Avalon. When we return, we'll talk about another legend that followed the story of Arthur. Of course, that of the sword Excalibur, drawing it from the sword. Only the worthy would be able to carry that sword, much like Thor's hammer, it seems like. How about the quest and the crusades for the Holy Grail? Did these exist, and how did they get tied to the story of King Arthur? We'll talk about that and so much more. Stay tuned. We've got more coming your way here on Darkness Radio. Their findings and research. There are nights, and our listeners can attest to it, where I should, by all true accounts, I should be a dentist with the amount of teeth pulling I've done on the show in 11 years. And you are just great. I love the fact that you have so much to share, and you have so much energy to bring to this title. So thank you for doing that. It's a refreshing change from some of the authors we bump into over the years doing this type of show. I want to dig into the legend of Excalibur again. Another fascinating story, And I just want you to be prepared. You probably will break my heart if there's not a woman that hangs out in a lake and gives swords to people on occasion. But if there's a truth to it, let me know what that is, would you?
There is one.
Woo!
Kind of,
okay.
Sort of. The story of King Arthur we all know and love in Excalibur is that as he's dying, as he's lying mortally wounded after a final battle, he gives his sword to his trusted knight and tells him to throw the sword into a nearby lake. And the knight does this, and when he does, the sword tumbles through the air, and the arm of the beautiful and mysterious nymph-like creature, the Lady of the Lake, kind of like a lake-dwelling mermaid with legs, her arm comes out of the lake, grabs the weapon by the hilt, and takes it down into the watery depths. Now, that is the story of how Excalibur ends up in a lake and what happens to it. This Lady of the Lake character soon jumps out the lake in the story and ferries Arthur across to the Isle of Avalon, which lies in the middle of this lake, on a barge. So most of us tend to think of the Lady of the Lake, well, she takes it down and then she obviously goes back to wherever she lives in, under the water with the sword. But the next scene in the earlier stories of King Arthur is that the knight returns to Arthur only to find him being put in a boat by this Lady of the Lake, plus another couple of accompanying handmaidens, and ferried across to an island on the lake for his wounds to be tended. That's the Isle of Avalon, where he is said to have then been buried. Now, okay, that's when I first investigated the Arthur story, I thought this whole lot is far too out there to be based on any kind of historical fact. But no, it turns out that it could really have been associated with the original historical Arthur, because from Roman writers we know that the Celtic people of Britain, during the funeral of an important warrior, would take the sword of the warrior and throw it into a sacred pool or lake as an offering to a water goddess called Viviana. Now, could this have been where the kind of original story came from? People remembered that the historical Arthur's sword was thrown as an offering to a water goddess, Viviana. Well, when you realize that the name of the Lady of the Lake in the medieval romances is Viviana, Vivian, the Lady of the Lake, I am convinced that the story of the sword being thrown to the Lady of the Lake comes about because of this tradition that the Celts did of throwing swords to spirits to grant them safe passage to the underworld. But it's not only from Roman writers we know this. Archaeologists have found such items. They're called votive offerings. And there's many places in Britain where there have been lakes with islands in them in the olden days, but they've, in more recent years, dried up. They've been drained for farmland. And so dried up lakes have been able to be excavated by archaeologists. And they found that many of these ancient sacred lakes, in the dried up mud at the bottom of them, they've been able to find many sacred items that have been thrown into these stretches of water as offerings to some kind of ancient spirits, gods, or deities. And these include many swords. They clearly were not thrown there as rubbish. They were offerings. And in fact, what's really interesting is we know again from the Roman writers that the soldiers who came to Britain saw this being done and started to go native, if you like, and adopt this practice for themselves. But rather than throw swords and precious jewelry, they threw coins. And this tradition of throwing coins into sacred ponds, pools, or springs became the practice of wishing wells that still survives today.
Yeah, I know. I get bothered for that every time we go to a local mall and there's any kind of pool of water. I got to give out all my pennies and nickels and dimes for that. All right.
It's probably just a pool of water that happened to have got. I've seen people throw any pool of water. People throw money in.
Yes, we're a world that needs wishes granted. The Holy Grail.
Well, next time you do that, remember it probably started with the story of Excalibur.
That's very cool. The Holy Grail and the Crusades. How did this come together with the King Arthur tradition?
The Grail tradition is such a complicated one because we tend to think now of the Grail as being either two things. If you're a fan of Dan Brown, you think it's some significance to do with the holy bloodline of Jesus, that he still has some descendants today. If you lived in medieval times, later medieval times, you would have thought of the Holy Grail as being the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, as outlined in the Bible, which was then used to collect a few drops of his blood while he's on the cross. And eventually it ends up in Britain. And anybody who drinks from this cup is cured of all ills, cured of any sickness. And when Arthur becomes ill in the story, Merlin tells him that the only thing that can cure you is if you actually mount a quest by your knights to find this cup that once contained Jesus's blood. And if you can drink from that, you'll recover, and so will the whole kingdom around you, which is falling apart while you're ill. So the knights go searching for this, and eventually one of them finds it. But the earliest tales of King Arthur have the cup as being something completely different. It isn't the cup that was used at the Last Supper. It is used, supposedly, to collect drops of Jesus's blood, but it's used by Jesus's female disciple, Mary Magdalene, to collect a few drops of his blood. And it's a small scent jar that she's said to have had, called the alabaster jar, where she goes to the tomb to discover Jesus has risen from the tomb. Then he appears to her and shows her the wounds in his hands, and the blood that drips from it, she collects in this small perfume jar. And the reason she's got a perfume jar is that the Bible tells us that she's gone to the tomb to anoint Jesus's body with precious oils. And it is this cup that she uses to contain the blood. This becomes the Holy Grail in the earliest stories of the Arthurian romances. This then ends up in Britain, and Arthur's knights go searching for this. Now, I've written an entire separate book about the Holy Grail and this whole story called The Chalice of Magdalene, for obvious reasons. And it does seem to have been associated with the historical Arthur for the reason that when Rome was sacked by the barbarians in 410 AD, the Roman soldiers that were in Britain were withdrawn to continental Europe. Soon after this, it looked as if Rome was going to be repeatedly sacked. And so any items that were really important had been got out of Rome, taken to elsewhere in Italy, and eventually these items, a convoy of carts carrying the crown jewels or whatever else of the emperors, went to the last place in the Roman Empire, or ex-Roman Empire, they thought would be safe, which was across the sea on the island of Britain, and taken to the capital of Britain. Now, these items included, supposedly, the cup that had been used by Mary Magdalene to collect Jesus's blood, the original Holy Grail. Now, that is the story, but what's really interesting is the capital of Britain at the very time that the cup is supposed to have been brought here was Viraconium, where we know Arthur is eventually associated with.
You've got great ties. I mean, this is a fantastic story. Great to see that the legend comes together, makes sense, and fulfills kind of this promise that we've always been given with the fantasy. When we come back, I want to talk about the death of King Arthur. if someone this great, somebody this legendary, who was known to unite forces that were at one time battling each other to fight a more common good, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of feel, why is he not more celebrated? Why do we not see the tomb of King Arthur, and why was he so easily forgotten to time? We'll talk about that with our guest Graham Phillips when we return to Darkness Radio. People looked up to that was able to unify different warring factions to fight against one common enemy. Why is there not more of a memorial to King Arthur, to King Owen? Why is there not something, showing where this regal historian was buried?
Well, they say that history is written by the victors. Unfortunately, the Anglo-Saxons, the enemy, eventually took over the part of Britain where Owen Thangwyn, the man who may have been the historical Arthur, if all my research is correct, that was overrun by the Anglo-Saxons. And in fact, it was burnt to the ground, and a new city was never built upon it. And that is why it survives as ruins today in the countryside. In fact, you can go and visit these ruins. They're open to the public now. And there's a small museum on the site where you can go and see some of the finds that have been unearthed there. But sadly, the people that were living at Vericonium, when it was eventually overtaken by the Anglo-Saxons in 650 AD, their records were pretty much destroyed about whatever who was doing what, what, where and when. And so is also many of their monuments were destroyed by the Anglo-Saxons, including monuments to great kings.
Right, and I don't think a lot of people realize that a lot of these strange glyphs that appear on pyramids in Egypt that people mistake as UFOs or sky gods, things like that, sometimes it's glyphs that were there. Then as a new leadership took over, they would they would retool and change parts of the story. And sometimes as time and passing would go and the winds and the sands would blow, it would create these marriage of images. And I'm a numismatist, a coin nerd myself, and it's fascinating to see how many coins were destroyed because the king or the ruler of the time would punch usually a god or Hercules or a creature that they felt represented them, and then as soon as their rule was over, those coins were collected, melted down, and then new history was remarked on those coins, and statues, paintings, stories, manuscripts, anything that they could find to lay or bear witness to the past was destroyed, because in the eyes of the leader, this is where history begins, and they would move forward. So I don't know if a lot of our listeners realize that it's amazing, as you said, that any of this exists at this point because of how destructive mankind really is when it comes to rewriting history.
Well, this is exactly what happened in Vericonium around central England. Exactly. But luckily, in this case, one lady who was a princess in 650 AD when the Saxons were sacking Vericonium. This princess Helith, her name was, she managed to escape. She escaped into the mountains where she became a poet and wrote a series of poems describing what had happened in these poems, what happened when Vericonium and the surrounding area were invaded. And incredibly, in this poem, she describes where the kings of Powys was the area surrounding Vericonium, were buried. She actually calls their burial site the churches of Bassa. And she says that all of them, including Owen Thangwyn, the man who I believe was the historical Arthur, are buried at the churches of Bassa. And I thought, wow, I mean, this poem still survives. 1400 years old almost, and it still survives at Oxford University's Bodleian Library. It's there for anyone to see if you can read Brythonic, but copies have been made in English. Now, it tells us the churches of Bassa is where Owen was buried. If you look at a map of the area around Vericonium, about 8 miles to the north, there is a place called Bass Church. Churches of Bassa, Bass Church, surely it's got to be the same place. And I managed, and just outside what's now a village called Bass Church, there's what was at the time Arthur was said to have lived, a hillock, an island in the middle of a lake that had been, archaeologists have investigated that and found that it was in use as some kind of ceremonial site around 500 AD. And it seems that this island in a lake was in fact what was the original churches of Bassa, the burial site of the historical Owen Llangwyn, the man who I believe was Arthur. And like Arthur, Owen Llangwyn ends up being buried on an island in a lake. Now, many parts of this lake have been dried up now, but it tells us this poem. From this poem, you can work out where Owen was buried. And I managed to organize a archaeological team to go there with geophysics equipment. That's technical equipment like ground sensing radar, which can produce a 3D image of what lies buried under the soil without digging. And they discovered that right where I said, according to this poem, Owen Llangwyn should lie, there is a ditch that had been dug and then filled in again many centuries ago, 6 feet wide, 6 feet deep. And right at the center of it, there's a big iron object. And the archaeologists, professional archaeologists, believe that this is a skeleton of a man buried on his side, and the metal object is a shield. And this is exactly how warriors were buried 1,500 years ago. So I think that I have found King Arthur's tomb. All I need to do now is get permission to dig him up.
Well, go ahead. We give you permission from Darkness Radio.
Unfortunately, I need permission from a government department in England called English Heritage, and I'm waiting in a queue.
You and your excuses, Graham. I said do it. Just do it. Come on, blame it on Schrader in America. What are they going to do? Cane me?
Well, the only problem is that I wouldn't know what I was looking at, because bones, after all that long, don't look very much like bones anymore.
No, they don't. They don't. But, it might be interesting, especially if it was covered in a shield, what the shield was made of and how much of the shield protected the remains underneath it.
Well, yes, it's very possible that we could get something from this shield to tell us that this was Arthur. But what I really like the idea of is, remember I said that the lake that surrounded where Arthur was buried is said to have been where Excalibur was thrown.
Right.
Well, Excalibur in the earliest stories is said to have a golden hilt, and it's said to have depicted 2 intertwined serpents. So we know what Arthur's sword is supposed to have looked like, and we know that it was made out of gold. Now, gold isn't going to rot away over the years. Right next to where this burial site is, part of the lake still survives, somewhere called Birth Pool. And it's a large lake. And I've actually managed to organize a forensic marine archaeological team to go up and down the lake with scanning the bottom of the lake with sonar and other sorts of geomagnetic equipment. And they've had divers go down there, and it does seem that there's a golden object. All we've got to do at the moment is figure out a way of dredging up 4 feet of mud that's on top of it without destroying it.
Wow, what an amazing story. And how does that feel for you? I know we've got a minute and a half left together, Graham, and I hate to give you such a big question in that time, but to have put these pieces of a puzzle together and then go out there on a wing and a prayer on this treasure map that you've found and put together of this history, and there's a body and there's a golden thing hidden in the water right where you thought it would be. How does that feel?
Well, after 25 years of on and off doing it, it feels absolutely great. So the reason I'm not rushing out there to dig it up right away is I need a rest.
I understand, but time is of the essence, my friend. We only today is promised to us, and that's not always the truth either. I hope you get the answers you're seeking, I can't wait to see what you find when you dig up the gravesite. And I hope that you'll return to the show and visit with us when that excavation takes place and when you hit the water and find the true Excalibur.
Well, hopefully it'll happen over this summer, and I'd love to come back on the show.
Great. Just shoot me an email. I'll join you. If I have to go walk around in the muddy water with my bare feet digging around for a sword, I'll help out.
Great stuff. You'll be most welcome.
Graham Phillips, you are a fascinating guest, and you're going to join me on Coast to Coast, I think, on the 8th of May. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you as we're joined by you for a few hours regarding King Arthur and a lot of the legends and other parts of the story that we didn't cover tonight. And we'll be looking at, with another guest, the Atlantis mystery and history. We'll be doing that on Coast to Coast AM. For our listeners, go find it, coasttocoastam.com. Find out where the stations are in your city, state, and country to listen to the show. It's been a pleasure, Graham. Thank you so much. And we'll join you all back here Monday night with Parashare and Supernatural News right here on Darkness Radio.